Thank you, Dr. Arnold. So, all right, welcome everybody after lunch. I know you guys are digesting food, but there are exciting topics coming up. So, our first speaker for Soul Water session is Dr. Drew Golson. He is irrigation specialist at Mississippi State with heavy extension appointment. Based at Delta Research and Extension Center. Last year, we talked about some soil moisture sensors. So this year, this topic will be cover irrigation scheduling based on soil moisture sensors. So with that, I will invite Dr. Golson.
Thank you. Thank you, Summit. Appreciate the invite to be here and just be a part of this. My first time here in Stillwater in general, but also specifically at the winter crops meeting. So I'm appreciative to being a part of this and impressed with really everything I've seen so far, but especially just getting through the tour that we had right before lunch is makes me feel pretty jealous of what all they all have here, and that's quite impressive. You should feel proud of that. So I am from Mississippi at Mississippi State University, and the irrigation extension specialist, and also coordinate the National Center for Alluvial Aquifer Research, which is a long name to say we do research on the aquifer, specifically the Mississippi River alluvial aquifer. And I think the first question I typically get, especially when we come this side of the Mississippi River, is y'all irrigate in Mississippi? And so I feel like I have to defend my job a lot of the times of how easy it may be that we have to irrigate. You're the irrigation specialist in a place that gets 60 plus inches of rainfall. But it's interesting. I'm actually from about 3 hours, a little over 3 hours south of here, just on the other side of the Red River in North Texas, outside of Wichita Falls. And so I grew up very similar to this. I did understand how important water was to everything that we did in our operation. And then, my grandfather always had lots of jokes that he thought were a lot funnier than what I felt like they were at the time. But one of his is every year when we would plant, he would say, Drew, just make sure you plant west to east, and as far east is the better. And so I always looked at them like, why do you want me to plant from west to east and go further? I can't go any further east. But it was from the rainfall standpoint. He thought that was funny, and he said it every single year. And so I guess I listened to him, and I migrated over east to Mississippi. And one of the parts coming from Texas at Texas A&M and the work that we were doing, and then moving over to the center that we had, the National Center for Alluvial Aquifer, is we've got a water problem, and we have a lot of effort and some financial support from the federal side of things that we're looking to create this center, and we want to focus on irrigation strategies. And my first thought was maybe some similar to some of y'all is how hard is that going to be? We got plenty of water. We should be able to manage this. There should be easy tweaks. And so as I walk through this, I think my mind was changed, and there's a lot of different areas. So, and I don't know how much of y'all have irrigated acres in the state, and I know so some of this may not apply. Just as I mentioned, where I'm from, just outside of Wichita Falls, we didn't have irrigation, but water was an important part of that. And so maybe some of the work that we've done in Mississippi can be applicable to you, or maybe into the future, way we think and the way we operate and the way we manage some of our crops from a water restriction standpoint. This map shows, let me just go through it. So the red dots represent 1,000 acres of decrease of irrigated acres, 1,000 of decreased irrigated acres, and the blue dots represent 1,000 acres of increased irrigated acres. So you really easily see the shift in irrigated acres across the United States. Out west, we're losing irrigated acres. There's some pockets that are adding and increasing. And then if you're wondering where our center is and where I spend most of my time, there's the pointer. I don't know if you can see that. but that is the outline of the Mississippi River alluvial aquifer. And that is the exact outline of the aquifer. You don't have to guess where the fringes are, the perimeter of that aquifer is. And so as you can see, there's a big importance of a lot of increased irrigated acres. And especially in the last 20 years, we've doubled our amount of irrigated acres. And so when we look at groundwater withdrawals, specifically to not just total withdrawals, but specifically to irrigation, just as the last update, the Mississippi River alluvial aquifer actually just went just above the High Plains aquifer as far as withdrawals for ag or for irrigation. And so it's an important aquifer, but it's also a lot of going on as far as how we irrigate. And this also shows in the same report, we're also a lot different in how we irrigate. Most of our irrigation is furrow irrigation. There's a lot of reasons for that. I mentioned how much rainfall we get. And when I first moved over there, I thought, this should be a pretty easy fix if we be more efficient when you get this much rainfall. But what I really quickly realized is we spend about half the year trying to get water off the field and the other half of the year trying to get water onto the field, because most of that rainfall does not fall during our growing season. And so obviously the amount of effort and dollars put into creating new irrigated acres is important, because they saw the need to add water during those times when we're not getting that rainfall. And so most of our rainfall, over 80% of that's going to fall outside of our growing and our critical window for our crops. And just as a quick background, majority of our crops, or majority is going to be soybean, then corn, and then cotton. And we have some rice as well. And so furrow irrigation, with the alluvial aquifer is a shallow, high productive aquifer. We have our fields are very flat. And so it really, all that equation kind of adds up to why we have a lot of furrow irrigation. And so that's where we spent most of our time. That this graph shows you that split of how much of our 83% in the state is going to be furrow irrigation. And then this is the outline in the state of where our irrigated acres go. So really here in the delta portion of the state over the alluvial aquifer, the delta counties, they're going to be somewhere between 60 and 80% of those acres are going to be irrigated. So that's enough about what that area. I just felt like it's important to give a little context to some of the areas that from the area that we do in this work. And I know, trying to look at irrigation scheduling, and specifically, I'm going to talk about using soil moisture sensors, the context where this is coming from, and try. I think a lot of this can still be applied here as we move out west. But number one, I think the first question I always get is, like I mentioned earlier, y'all actually irrigate? So I feel like I need to do a little bit of background to justify what we're working with. And then, so, having that back and forth between too much water and then not enough water, and how that can go really quickly, even within a season. And so before I go into what we focused on and what our background has really been over the last, since I've been there 6 years, is looking at sustainability and what that sustainable agriculture is. And I know that word gets used quite a bit. It's the buzzword that we've had for several years is sustainable. But I want to make it important when we look at if we're talking about conservation practices and conservation practice adoption, we want to make sure it is sustainable, but it needs to fall. It's not just going to be environmental sustainable, because if it saves the water, but it's not economically viable, or it's too complicated to use, then the grower's never going to use it, and I'm wasting my time, and I'm wasting the grower's time. So we try to make sure that everything we do falls within that. So it's got to be economically viable. It's got to make money, or it's increased profitability as we reduce the amount of inputs we add into it. And it's got to be socially sustainable. Is it easy to use? Does it make life easier? Can I manage a lot of the sensors that while I work with one-on-one with growers, we get to this point to where they're saying, now I'm able to, they feel like it was going to add work to it. And a lot of the way we irrigate in Mississippi, or the growers irrigate in Mississippi, is they have this big spin cycle. And I want to start on Monday, and I want to be able to be finished with my last field by Friday, so that we can do stuff with the family. And if you change that, then now I'm starting on Wednesday and now I'm irrigating on a Saturday, and I'm not going to be happy about that. But as we work with them and see with using sensors and having other data points to help decide when to irrigate, it really frees up a lot of time. And that's one of the conversations we get a lot as we go forward is I thought it was going to add more time. I thought it was going to add, but it's actually freed up. I'm sitting there at my son's baseball game looking at my sensors and understanding that I don't need to irrigate and I can keep moving forward. And it's got to be ecologically, like I said, environmentally. We want to make sure that ultimate goal is we want this water to be used into the future. And so if we're not if we're overusing that water, then that's not sustainable, and we can't grow as important as irrigation is in our state and other states as well. We want to make sure we can sustainable from an environmental standpoint. But like I say to most, if it was all about environmental sustainability, I would solve my job and be done out of work by just saying don't pump water, and that's going to solve the aquifer problem real easy. But obviously that doesn't work. We have a lot of economics and livelihoods that depend on that aquifer and depend on the crops that come out, and so we have to manage this as a whole to make sure we're balancing all of that. So most recently, just a few months ago, the NASS survey does irrigation water management. I'm going to have a few slides as we go through, just asking different questions to growers. What practices do you use? What do you not use? Why don't you use these? And one of them, I think, is just going through is what are the barriers? They ask these questions, and I think they should ask more questions because that I think some of the other areas of why they're not using it may be up there. They're just not getting asked that. But based off the questions they asked, you can see investing improvements is not a priority. So, well, if it's just not a priority, that's a hard audience for me to talk to. So maybe a third of y'all just may not be interested with that. But then as you go down further, it's finances, it's the cost of improvement, the cost of installation doesn't cost the benefit that I get. There's a reduce in yield, and a few other things that as we go through there. So financial is a big barrier that we see with that. And I understand that completely. And so we want to make sure as we go through this, we're also increasing profitability and not just asking you to take something on as far as a conservation practice that's going to hurt your bottom line. And we completely understand that. Another question is, what are the methods do you use when deciding to irrigate? And so you've looked at the top left over here. The number one is to be crop condition. And so how does that crop look? And I think, all of these, this is not separate. So if I use soil moisture sensors, I'm probably looking at crop condition. I'm probably also feeling the soil around. So they're not exclusive to each other, but that's number one reason or number one area that our growers are using to how they determine when to irrigate. And so a lot of times that can be at the early in the season, we are applying water too early in our vegetative state. We are not encouraging our roots to grow and to find that water and to become ready for those hotter July months as we go through. And so whether it's that soybean, cotton, or corn, and when we irrigate too early, we really are setting ourselves up to hurt ourselves and not being able to keep up with irrigation later in that season. And so understanding that crop growth. And so we have a lot of our crops that are going to look stressed that have adequate moisture in the profile. And understanding that has been very important. And then on the other side of that, maybe different parts in the season or a different part of that crop water use growth stage, if you see crop conditions or you see some stress in that crop, you may be too late. And so you've already heard it from that end. So it's not a good metric to use when deciding when to irrigate. Then filling of soil and then soil moisture sensors. And then over here at the far right is my neighbors. And that's a lie. They are using their neighbors far, far more when deciding to irrigate. They may not directly think that, but I do a lot of on-farm work with growers, and we put a lot of sensors out in their field, and we work with them on making that decision. And as soon as the neighbors start watering, that's when my pressure gets built up on phone calls come because he's watering. What's wrong with mine? Something must be wrong. So even though that's low, they're just not wanting to admit it. So I think neighbors have a big part in that. And so it's just getting the right neighbors to do the right thing, I think, is one area we're working on. So just kind of give some background into where we've been and what we've done. And I think, we've done a lot of research on soil moisture sensors to look at what scheduling thresholds are, when we want to maintain yield. Obviously, we want to find that point to where we're not hurting yield, but we're putting the least amount of water out. And a lot of things I mentioned and kind of alluded to, we're actually increasing yield because we're overwatering in some instances, especially early in the season. And so after we took our research from on station, we went on farm and we asked the farmer to give us one field, and we're going to schedule based off of what our recommendations and our research showed, and then the farmer was just going to irrigate based off of how he normally irrigates. And so just from some highlights from that over several years of on-farm comparisons, in our soybean fields, we had equal yields. And this was across about 4 to 5 years. And our water use went down 21%. We had equal net returns, so this is stating we're covering all the, if we bought soil moisture sensors or we bought another technology, we got our money back. We didn't increase it, but we equalized it. We paid for it. And then our irrigation water use efficiency went up 36%. And then as we moved to corn, we also really looked at, we were overwatering corn. The growers were overwatering corn by quite a bit, and especially what I mentioned earlier in the growth stage. And so we actually increased yield statistically across all on-farm comparisons. We reduced our water use by 40%. I mean, that's a lot of water we're able to capture with that. And then we increased our net returns and increased our water use efficiency by over 50%. And so I think moving to on-farm was a way that we really could show that, if we had soil moisture sensor schedules or thresholds, that we recommended, and we had these for each crop, and they can listen to that and understand that makes sense. But then most of the next question is, well, I don't know if that's going to work on my farm, or I don't know if it's going to work on a production scale, because I've got X number of wells and I've got how many acres that it cover, and I've got to keep those things moving. And so moving that on farm and showing them as a demonstration and collecting that data has been very valuable as we move forward from an adoption standpoint. And so when I talk about irrigation scheduling, it can get confusing from an education standpoint of taking that next step. And so, there's different types of sensors, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's really understanding the different types of sensors. A sensor is going to give you different numbers, and that's not helping our adoption rate is what these random number generators that they may be getting and putting in their field. And then how do we interpret that? What type of data do we have? And then where are those thresholds? Because ultimately we're trying to use these to make decisions. And then as I start working with growers on that on-farm comparison, but also through other extension and outreach efforts, here's some of the questions they start to answer, being able to answer, or even start asking themselves that they didn't think. And I think most of it is, the sensor is going to tell me when to irrigate. But here's some other questions that always come up as we start working with them is, the first one I already mentioned, when do I start irrigating? I think that's the first one that we all want to start using it for. But specific, in the Delta I mentioned, we get a lot of rain, and we get sporadic rainfall, rain showers in the growing season. And so there's the question is, when do I start after a rain? All our rains are not equal. And, even across our farms, we may have a rain that hit this field and not this field. And so, a heavy downpour that I mentioned that calendar mentality of when we start and when we finish. And if we had a half-inch rain, how long does that push me back? Or how effective was that rainfall? And we can get that from soil moisture sensors. So how much of that rain actually went into the profile, and very soil specific, obviously, as we look at that. So they may have certain fields. So that really opened up the eyes to a lot of our growers that when they had a rainfall come through, that certain fields were ready to go maybe after than what they were expecting, and some needed to go and wait a lot longer than after they expected. How much moisture am I using on a cloudy day, humid day, low humidity? It's great conversations we've had, as you can see that crop water use throughout the season. season. I talked about different growth stages, but as our daily averages, we can look at those. They really get into that. And then you can see the crop water use really slow down. We can ask our questions why. And a lot of that is cloudy days. And then how much that crop is using per day is not going to be equal across that board. And so that's all going down to how much moisture is in the profile and how long can I last until my next irrigation. And then irrigation soil type, can I use my same trigger for all our soil types? And then I get this question: is my cover crops, are they helping? Am I capturing more water? Am I storing more water? Is it the water lasting longer? Is it increasing water holding capacity? And then I think the most common question I get with our crops in both soybean, corn, and cotton is when can I stop irrigating? And then we can really utilize soil moisture sensors, understanding how much moisture we have in the profile, how much is it being used on a daily basis, and then how long until we can terminate, we can make that decision. And a lot of times we're cutting a lot of our irrigation that I mentioned on that termination. We're not doing that last irrigation. And the way we irrigate, that can be a high percentage of how of reducing that water. So just the effort that we've done over the last several years, looking at these triggers and moving on farm and then really focusing on that, we've really increased our adoption on soil moisture sensors since 2018. And as you can see, compared in these two slides from 2018 into 2023. And if you look across the nation, what that irrigation water management survey looks like on soil moisture sensors. So I think I think this is very geographic. I think a lot of other areas it can be more difficult to sell that. Obviously, irrigated acres makes a big play into that. But how our weather is, and especially in the South, is one of our first questions. Again, why do you irrigate? Why do you need to irrigate? But using these and understanding how we can utilize the rainfall that we get during that growing season and using it most effectively, our growers have really seen the benefit on understanding the timing. So I'm going to walk through just some background on different types of sensors, and I'm going to show you some of the data that we've collected with some of the newer data with comparing different sensor and telemetry service types that really illustrate the timing and that window that we may have. So most common that we have that we're utilizing is going to be watermark sensors and the soil capacitance probe or our Syntec probe. And so I think the next picture may show that this watermark sensor is going to be, there's advantages and disadvantages. The watermark is you're going to put it at the depth that you want it to be. So we have our recommendations, and then the Syntec is just going to be a long probe, and you have different stacked sensors along that. So with a watermark, you're going to have to put as many depths as in there. You're going to have to drill and place that as many different times. And then the Syntec is going to be one probe with different stacked sensors across. But here's an example of this is in soybean specifically, but a lot of our crops are going to very much mirror this, maybe in slightly different. But this crop water use graph that we have, I think, is the biggest advantage that when we work and train growers on how to use sensors, that really helps. If we're irrigating at the beginning of the season in our vegetative state like we would in the middle of the season, we're way over irrigating. That crop is not using the water. And if we're doing the same thing on the back end, I think the next one's for corn. We have really low sensitivity to water stress in our corn environments, and we also have really wet winters. And so our lowest yields that we have historically in Mississippi is on our wet maize or early season wet years, because we've really stunted our growth in our crops. So if the drier it is in our spring, the higher the yields we've historically seen with our really all crops, specifically corn, which shows you that we're continuing. If we're irrigating too early, we're hurting ourselves. And so where it's low sensitivity to our yield reduction, that's the time we want to really push it to grow and increase that root. Let them go find that moisture moisture. I'm always, talking about if I have two children, and if I give them a plate full of macaroni and green beans and the chicken, and every time they finish that macaroni and cheese, I plop another spoonful of macaroni and cheese on it, they're going to keep eating that macaroni and cheese, and they're never going to go look around and find that chicken or that broccoli or green beans on there. And so it's the same way. If we keep feeding that water too early, we're not encouraging those roots to go find that water, and we really set ourselves up for if we have a dry June and July, then we're not setting our crops up for success, as they're going to be a lot shallower and then more susceptible to heat stress. I'm going to go through some examples. So the higher on this graph, the higher the number, that's an irrigation, that's a rainfall. And so one of the things that we've talked about with a grower, this is crop water use, is it's going down, and then the jump up is going to be water added to that profile. And so we walked with a grower a couple of years ago that showed him this, and he has a hard pan, he has compaction, he's having a difficulty having any infiltration past that 6 inches. So what he thought he was applying irrigation, having a full profile recharge, nothing made it really past 6 inches. And he had no idea until we put a soil moisture sensor. That kind of goes back to that questions that we're answering beyond just when to irrigate. This helped with that. And when we changed up his he started subsoiling and doing some things different on his farm and trying to slow that water down a little bit as well. Here's another graph that we worked with. It is we have part of our region has very heavy clay, holds and stores that moisture for a really long time, and we can hurt ourselves by applying water, and especially if we have a rainfall event following that irrigation. And so, as you can see, field capacity is this blue area here. We irrigated, and then they had a rainfall, and it spent a lot of time up in that field capacity. It's fully saturated, and then we used the water. Crop used the water. We irrigated here, bumped back up, and it stayed up here. And then we had another little small rainfall, and it jumped back up. And so the amount of time that we're spending in this oversaturated zone is hurting us just as much as a drought stress portion of that. And so, sometimes you cannot, obviously, you never can predict Mother Nature on when it's going to rain. But if you're irrigating here, and you didn't need to, and you pumped back up here, you're not allowing the dry down. And so as you're having your roots utilize moisture deeper and grower, you're really encouraging that, and we can easily oversaturate some of our soils. And I think the mentality of a lot of our growers was some water's good, more water's better, so I'm going to keep irrigating that. And we really are showing that through these sensors that we can be hurting ourselves. And that's when the increased yield comes in. And then throughout the season, I've got these lines to kind of show you without working through every different depth. But at each depth, we're using less water later in the season. That kind of follows that crop water use graph that I mentioned earlier. And so, if we're irrigating on the same timing that we are during the middle of the high peak water use, later in the season or early in the season, we're over irrigating. And early in the season and late in the season is typically where I can really capture that water use when I compare it to a grower. And we looked at those numbers of how much we're using less. It's because I'm irrigating less earlier and I'm cutting off later, and I'm holding on longer on the back end of it. And that's where we really gain that water use. Again, not be able to see that unless you have irrigation. Here's another example of irrigations, and then our different depths just not getting infiltration. So going beyond what it looks like from just answering that when to irrigate, but also what it may be other issues from a soil management that we have going on. Here's a grower that we put a sensor on their field, and we gave them this red as their threshold. It said irrigate when it gets up to here, and then that's our trigger. And then he trusted us, went through it, and he followed us exactly. You can see a rainfall. You had an irrigation right before we got to there, and then as we moved up here, you can see that slower. It's a little flatter at this part right here. That's because we had a rainfall, but that rainfall didn't really start his whole set over again, but he kept it going, irrigated shortly after, and we went through. And this red line here in soybean specifically, we have our irrigation termination at 6.5, R6.5, and he irrigated right before that, and we were done. And he did a really good job. This is that same farmer the year before. And as you can see, here was my threshold. I told him to follow, and he just irrigated. And we never even got close to our threshold. And then he had this other field. We showed him at the end of the season where let's try to push this up. And he allowed us less time. But also you can see here, R6.5, we've shown no advantage to irrigating after R6.5. And then so one of his irrigations happened after that termination. And I also could argue this irrigation right here, where he probably had about several days before we hit that trigger, and we had a pretty heavy rainfall right after that. So without going into too many what ifs, I can guarantee you 2 irrigations by using soil moisture sensors could have been saved with this grower. And it's really cheap. We're one of the cheapest places to irrigate. It's very shallow, like I mentioned, a lot of furrow irrigation. But just based off this, we doubled, and we more than paid for our sensors this in year 1 with him. And so he took it to that next year, and we showed. And so these are the kind of conversations that we can see. And I think it's not just following that threshold, but it's following those thresholds based on crop water use and looking at those different crops. And so as we move forward with that, over the last couple of years, I've had a lot of questions about different companies that come up with and using different sensor types. There's different telemetry, there's different sensor types. And so what we wanted to do is just compare and look at different ways. I could answer questions based off of, we've thought a lot of our sensor adoption really is because of these companies that have invested in this telemetry. And so you can go from just reading data to algorithms that's going to tell you when to irrigate. And so they've been very, very helpful with that. And so I mentioned this earlier, we can really hold off. We try not to irrigate in our vegetative stage. And when we're peak, it's about 1/4 inch a day. And so looking at the different comparisons, we had our farmer method, which would be our calendar method. We had our recommendations, and then we had several other Smart Farm, Valley Irrigation. Our water center has come up with a water balance model, just looking at what's going in, what's being predicted to come out from the crop water use, and if we can come up with cheaper or even free apps to look at that. We had a water balance I mentioned, Syntec relative depletion based on crop water use that we've come up with, a free app, and then another sensor company called Goanna that incorporates sensor data plus crop canopy temperature. As you can see, all pretty relatively equal across the board. This was in our first season, just on yield. So this is in soybean, as I mentioned earlier. You also can see why we have irrigation. We can increase our yield. But when we dive a little bit, let me go into 2024. We sought to see a little bit differences coming up. Again, specifically, you can see no irrigation control. Adding that irrigation last year, or this year, excuse me, made a big difference in our yield. But I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of these numbers of looking at what happened with those yields to see if the different comparisons going across. And so that first year in 2023, we had almost 11 inches during that growth, the effective rainfall during those growth stages. And then we had number of irrigations here. IWA is irrigation water applied, and then there's days in between is what we looked at. So this just shows, backs up what we've been trying to stress here is the most amount of irrigations is 6.5. And I know the reason that's not a whole number is because we broke our plots out and watered those individual replications into it. But almost 7 irrigations had the lowest yield. And so the most amount of water at 12 inches had the lowest yield. And if you look at what had the highest, that was 9 inches, almost three inches below. So we continue to show that not just irrigating is maybe I'll save water with my irrigation. I'm not just wasting water, but also we're wasting and reducing our yield. And so I think that shows you very well that there's this window. We can over irrigate and we can under irrigate, and being able to understand what's in the profile is very important. So going into a lot drier year, this past year, we only had 1.5 inches between our effective rainfall during our growth window. And so this was the first year in the 6 years that showed this is the least amount of rainfall that I've had on any of my studies. And this was the first year really that the more water you applied, the higher the yield you got. And so this is when the growers say, "See, I told you so." But again, the one out of 6 years, and these are the hard times for me to say why. It was easy for me to just go on a calendar and maintain and get the same amount of yield as you did using a sensor. But this was rare, and we only had 1.5 inches. And so utilizing the spot up rainfalls that we get is very important. But even with this year, you can see our highest yield here still. It was not our highest water use. If you go up here to our weekly calendar, they used 2 inches more and still had numerically lower yield. So even with a really, it's all about timing. So some of these, as we dove into earlier, of looking at different timings, the max distance between, it wasn't just totally the water applied, you got more yield. It was some of these got irrigated too early, and then that's where we saw the lower yield numbers into it. And so I think as you go through this and understanding this is the yield and this is the number of irrigation events, the more gaps you have here is going to really show that we can over irrigate. And I think that's one of the biggest messages that we have in looking at why soil moisture sensors can help pay for themselves. It's not just, hey, I don't have to apply as much water. That's very important. No one wants to waste a resource that we have. We want to be able to utilize this resource for as long as possible, but also understanding when to apply and how much to apply at the different growth stages is really, I kind of view the soil moisture sensors really open up a window to the profile to understand what's going on. Do we have other issues that maybe not showing from an irrigation standpoint, but do we have do we have compaction issues? Are we J rooting? Are our roots not getting it to a depth that we thought? How much infiltration are we having through our irrigation? How much infiltration are we having from our rainfall events? And it really helps us guide our way through that. And so just another study I want to highlight just real quickly is the same kind of showing in cotton. We set a 90 centibar, which is drier. This is 130, which is the driest trigger. And then 50 is going to be our wettest. And so we lost yield when we over irrigated, and we lost yield when we under irrigated. And so again, finding that sweet spot and understanding here's our driest, here's our middle ground, and here's our wet, and finding our sweet spot and this is cotton irrigation, to really looking at 90 kPa in our soil type in Mississippi was really honing in on, and then we can go out and work with our growers to get into that point. And then we looked at termination. I mentioned R6.5 on soybean. We looked at cracked boll 2 weeks before, 1 week before, 1 week after, 2 weeks after, and 3 weeks after. And over these 3 years, we saw no difference on when we could terminate. We didn't get any yield benefits by terminating irrigation later on. And so this really helps our water use efficiency. And in fact, later on, a few other issues we've had with boll rot by irrigating after cracked boll. And so trying to hold off and really, I mentioned earlier, cutting that irrigation off sooner is going to be an area where we can really make up our water use efficiency applications. And this is just kind of a point, not really plugging our Mississippi Master Irrigator program, but I know Summit has one, and Oklahoma State has a Mississippi or Oklahoma Master Irrigator program. And one thing I really understood, I mentioned the barriers is financial. There's NRCS and EQIP programs, but tying that to education and training and understanding how to use these and how to use them correctly has been very beneficial. So I want to make sure y'all are aware of that, and it's a good program that started that we tried to mirror since then. But with that, I'm going to come back up a second time so we also can do some questions after that, unless we have some time. Okay. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. I'm sorry. In our soils, we have we have a lot of variation in our soils. So as that, we're right next to the Mississippi River. So we have some areas that should be a swamp still that they cleared out and drained and that hold water for days. And then we have some silt loams that really crust over. And so, I mean, a part of one of the reasons that we have that I think soil moisture sensors are beneficial for us is we have, and that can be within one field. And we've, as that river meandered and deposited all these, you can see these old veins that go through there, and it really distributes it. So, but clay to silt loam, and it really varies heavily as we go across even a field. 40%, we did with that. His question was that 40% on corn, was it across? That is lumped together across all farms and multiple soil types. But most of our corn, just based off of the preference of the growers and yield being one of those reasons, is more on our lighter texture soil. It's less grown on our clay. There are some that do it for a rotation, but we try to cover as many different soil types, and we followed some growers based off their rotation. Yeah. Yes. Oh, sorry. Do we have time?
Yeah, you got time. I'm trying to get something in my which one was it?
Are you seeing a fit for different types of soil moisture probes on different soils? Like which ones work better on sand versus silt loam?
So for them, generally, I think I would say, pick one and we use them across all the different soil types. There are some different types so kind of getting into the specifics, but there is a watermark sensor that's stacked that a company has come out with. So, the green one that depending on the depth that you push it, they have a stacked version of that. We have seen very difficult, that doesn't work well with our soils. It worked really well in sandier soils, but I think the biggest issue that I would say based off your question is soil and sensor connection. And so we have our lighter soils are going to work really well across any of them. And then our cracking clays they're going to crack open when it gets dry. And so we have some soil contact issues in some, but we looked at different ways to install those. But those stacked ones with our watermark, we could not handle that, and we broke them off because it really didn't, as it went down, those ones below the top one did not get the soil to sensor contact with it. So Syntec with the capacitance probe, it's harder to read a heavier clay than a silt loam. I mean, the silty loams are harder to read on a capacitance probe within our clay soils. It's a pretty straightforward and very pretty graphs. And then when we get into our silt loams, that gets ugly and open to interpretation. And that's where some of our algorithms kind of get haywire.
I was just curious did you find any advantages to the integration of the crop canopy temperature sensors?
It did. I mean, I think just based off the comparison, my overall, I mean, kind of based on the last two questions, my overall recommendation is any sensor or any scheduling tool is better than guessing. And that was across the board. There might be specifics, and then based off of crop type that a grower has or dominant soil type that they may have, there may be ones that are better fit. But we irrigated based off the canopy temperature, and it helped in a sense that maybe if we had other areas, because I mean, at the end of the day, we're taking a point in a field that may be the size of a tennis ball and trying to make a decision that may be 40 acres and maybe 160 acres based off that decision. So I think other data points that add to that is always helpful. And we did see some things that maybe that helped us that soil moisture alone didn't show. Even some of this stress on the front end of the earlier season, but they tweaked their algorithm that we kind of fed back into them. They have never done. They worked a lot in cotton with the guana sensor. They have never done it in soybean, and so we are able to tweak some of their algorithms based off of our soil type and our crop type with it.
Any there?
Did you do any fertilizer testing with your water?
No, we did not. I mean, we've done some other interactions with nitrogen application in water, but most of what I showed today is really just me measuring water and how different. And so the grower data, there was all different management strategies. We just, whatever they did, we just collected and showed when to apply that water. And then the sensor comparison study, we had a blanket application.
Any more questions? Not. Thank you. Thank you, Drew. So our next speaker is Dr. Meetpal Kukul. He is irrigation engineer at University of Idaho, and he will be talking about crop coefficients. So crop coefficients, one of the topics that I'm also looking forward to is the silent warriors that we use in ET calculations. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Sharma and Dr. Arnold, for the invitation. So I'm from Idaho. I'm with the University of Idaho in Boise. You're probably thinking of potatoes, and you're right. So I'm in southern Idaho, which is a high desert environment. It's probably on the other end of the spectrum that what Dr. Goldson was talking about. And we only get about 10 to 11 inches of precip. That's rain plus snow every year. 3/4 of that, we get it during the winters. So we're basically essentially dry all during summer. So it's wild, wild west, but dry west, right? So, and I'm not, the intent of my talk is not here to bring and show you data from where I'm at, but essentially build your ability to estimate evapotranspiration via the use of crop coefficients. And a lot of that fundamental work was conducted in Idaho and southern Idaho specifically. So right off the bat, let me ask you, who's heard of crop coefficients and who knows crop coefficients? Okay, hopefully we'll change that in some time. So whenever we talk about irrigation management, are really the fundamental critical piece that we're trying to figure out by any means is soil water depletion. And that includes the use of in situ soil moisture sensors, because this is the quantity that we essentially have them try to read. And to really understand what that depletion number is, we try to think of the soil column as this bucket, where it's full at a point, which is typically called field capacity, And then you start draining as you start using up some of the water. What you're trying to avoid is getting closer to this point, because this is where you'll see yield penalties. Midway or somewhere, based on how you want to manage your crop, you can define this imaginary line, which is called allowable depletion. And as an irrigation manager, your job is to keep the depletion within this territory right here. If you see the depletion going beyond this, you can expect some stress to incur. Now, how do we get to the saltwater depletion? Of course, we just heard a talk about soil moisture sensors, so there's that route. One of the barriers that we saw on Dr. Goldson's slide was inability or unwillingness to spend on sensors. That's really been a long-standing barrier to adoption of soil moisture sensors. So there's an alternate route, which is what I'm going to be talking about, and that is the crop coefficient way. So basically, we start thinking about our soil column as a bank account, right? So we had a depletion number yesterday. There was some water used, which is evapotranspiration. And then we have additions to that bucket. That could be either precipitation or irrigation. Now, there's good ways of getting to precipitation. Of course, you can install a rain gauge, or you can refer to a weather station monitoring network. And then we know what we're applying. So the hard job is to predict ET. It's something that a lot of people have spent many careers on. So ET is really hard to determine. And that is where this talk will focus about. So what is evapotranspiration, essentially? Let's start with that. So basically, it's the opposite of precipitation. This is the water flux that's going out of the system. It's invisible, of course. And why is this important from a water resource management standpoint is this water essentially leaves the system, right? We never see that water again. It basically goes out, and it's essentially in the local system, it's not usable again. Depending on where you are and what you're growing, this ET could be 40 to 100% of your additions to the soil column. Other scientists from Oklahoma have measured that in these systems, the ET can be 77% of annual rainfall amount. Of course, this number will be lower when you factor in irrigation. But also, so not only is the largest component, but it's also most uncertain component of the soil water balance, which means if you can do a good job at determining this with robustness, you're doing a good job with your irrigations. So this is really a precursor for soil water budget-based irrigation schedules. So really, how do you, when you don't have, in the 1600s, how do you measure evaporation? You basically boil a pot of water, right? And try to monitor rate changes. And this is what some of the early researchers and philosophers even tried to do in those times. And then they obviously found out that temperature, heat, as well as wind seemed to have an effect. And in the delta of the years that we're standing on today, and 1687, we've gone a long ways in doing this, and we're able to predict evaporation from large reservoirs. And what we're talking about is a soil crop system, which is where it gets really complicated. And rightly it has been said that within the field of meteorology, evaporation is the most desperate science. And I really believe that it stays that way in many ways, even today. All right, so in modern times, how do we measure evapotranspiration? Now, minded that this is measuring evapotranspiration, we're actually trying to document how much water is leaving from the system. And these are pictures from the 70s where Dr. Jim Wright in Kimberly, Idaho, installed some lysimeters. And these lysimeters are essentially some large steel boxes, think of them that way, and then you basically dug a pit, install them in there, and try to monitor weight changes in that bucket. There are load cells beneath these buckets that can monitor, they're very sensitive to changes. And that way you can really develop this curve where you're looking at lysimeter mass on a really a minute scale during the day. And then this can be translated to how much water leaves the system. Of course, the slope of this is the highest during midday. This is when the maximum evapotranspiration is happening. So it's likely 1 to 3 p.m., that sort of time during the day. And this early work in the 70s and the 80s is really the bread and butter of what went into the FAO 56 document, which is what my talk is based on. And this is really the text that we refer to when computing evapotranspiration. This is really the benchmark in our discipline. So a lot of Dr. Wright's work went into this. I don't want to dig a pit, right? I don't want to do all that. So how do we do this today? We install these flux towers. These are really advanced weather stations that are measuring the water vapor concentration in the air at very high frequencies. Of course, really expensive, but essentially what we're trying to do is install them so that they're reading the water vapor in the air from a footprint, and the footprint is ideally our field, our target field. Now, of course, I can go ahead and do this. If I have millions and millions of dollars, I can install a bunch of these, right? But they're not scalable. You cannot really deploy these out in every field that you want to really manage irrigations in a sound way, which is where crop coefficients come into play. So some smart people got around and they said, hey, how about we separate out the effects of weather from evapotranspiration? So we view evapotranspiration as something that's driven by weather, plus it's driven by crop. So that's why we break it down into two quantities, which is the crop ET, which is our quantity of interest, and then there's a reference ET. And if you take a ratio of them, this is what we call a crop coefficient. You're gonna see this KC pop up a lot on the screen, so that is what it means. It's the crop coefficient. So reference ET, now this is a really smart move because reference ET is quite predictable. It's not as hard to get around. We basically have a formula. Of course, a lot of work went into this, developing this, but resolving this equation only needs 4 parameters that we're measuring at really high densities, I would say, especially in the state of Oklahoma via the Mesonet. And it's really, I have to say, it's one of the best weather networks I've seen in the country, and of course, globally. So you're deploying these weather stations, you're getting air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. You plug them into this equation, and you can get to reference ET. And then if you know what these crop coefficients are, and how do you know them? If you go back, all that hard work, we know what the crop ET was. So can we bring it into this equation? So we have crop ET from expensive sensors. We have reference ET from Mesonet. That way we can compute crop coefficients. And these are, of course, these are scalable because at any place you can measure reference ET, you know what the crop coefficient is going to be, which is mostly, it's a very conservative quantity. It won't change too much. And we'll go into cases where it does change. And that's how you can get into crop ET. You can multiply your crop coefficient with your reference ET. So what is reference ET? It's an imaginary concept. It doesn't exist. So this reference crop does not exist. It could either be a grass surface or it could be an alfalfa surface. We like to call them that, but they don't exist because there are very strict restrictions on what these surfaces look like. This is a grass surface that always stays 12 centimeters long. Okay, so you're getting into some serious mowing if you want to maintain that. So essentially, grass surface is when you have this 12 centimeter high grass and it's not water stressed. This, whatever it will evapotranspire is called a reference crop ET. And this is very convenient because we've really fixed all the dynamic factors a crop would have, crop controls on ET. We've really made them static for our convenience. And again, like I said, you only need these 4 parameters to measure these. and then you plug into this equation, you have reference ET. You keep doing that every day during the growing season. Once you do that, you're going to see, of course, reference ET, because of weather variations during the season, is going to follow this red line. It's cooler, of course. It's cooler in the fall, in the spring, and then this is the summer. So you expect this bell curve. But you also expect this bell curve with actual crop ET because of the leaf area, right? This is when the plant has greater leaf area, and this is when it starts to senesce. So both of these quantities follow this bell curve, but in different fashions, of course. And that is why when you divide the crop ET by the reference ET, you end up with this curve. Now, and this is really one figure that really encapsulates the crop coefficient concept. There's 4 phases. There's an initial phase, crop development phase, mid-season, and late season. And of course, there are dividers to define when one stage ends, then the other starts. And then you have crop coefficients themselves. So there's a crop coefficient for the initial period, and then it starts climbing up during the development phase, tends to stay the same during mid-season. This is the closed canopy situation. And this is during senescence, you see a descent curve. So basically, to reconstruct this curve, you only need to know the lengths of the 4 stages and the KC values themselves. And of course, these are crop dependent because that was the intent in the first place. These are crop coefficients, so they're specific to each crop. And where do you get these values? Go to FAO 56. So this is the document I was talking about. And in here, there's tables that essentially for each crop, including commodity field crops, but other specialty crops as well, they give you these values. However, it's good to go local, right? So where do you get these values for Oklahoma? You go to Mesonet. You don't have to resolve that complicated equation even. You just log on to Mesonet, and there's a bunch of these sites. And essentially, you can get daily short crop. It says short crop, so that refers to grass. The tall crop is alfalfa. So this is your reference CT at the daily scale. And you can do this for any weather station in the state. So, okay, I have reference CT for Oklahoma. How about crop ET? That's the quantity that I'm really after, right? And you can do that too. There's a specialty tool called Irrigation Planner within Mesonet, and that is where you define your site. And this is the site where a weather station exists. And then you plug in your crop, and then it asks you for a planting date and a relative maturity input. And then it gives you evapotranspiration. So you do not really have to compute a crop coefficient. You do not have to really resolve that curve even. It does the whole process for you, and you get to this crop evapotranspiration automatically that you can be using for your decisions. Now, how do I start to use these numbers? So I have crop ET, I have rainfall data, and this is this is a table exactly taken from the irrigation planner. So essentially, what I'm doing is I have a crop ET column, I have a rain column, and then I start accumulating ET. So this is each next cell is the summation of the previous day's ET plus today's ET. So you keep doing that both for ET as well as rain, and then compute a water deficit, which is additions minus what's going out. So rain's incoming, ET's outgoing. You do that and you get to this. So if it's a negative number, of course, it's a deficit. If it's positive, you have more water in the system, in the balance. So this is what the deficit. So if 21st of June is the date when you last irrigated, and this is when you're pulling up the data, which is today, this quantity, this water deficit in front of the last irrigated date is the deficit as of today. So this is what I need to replenish today. This is what this is the basic. This is what my bank account looks like in the soil. Now, alone, this does not make any sense. I cannot be using this to make any decisions. I really have to put in context, what does this deficit mean for my specific soil? And this is when we come back to that bucket diagram and taking an example, if corn growing in a silt loam soil, which has a root zone of 4 feet, with a field capacity defined at 23% translates to 11 inches of water. You get to wilting point at 4.8 inches of water. You subtract these two quantities, you get to water capacity, which is some 6 inches. Now, if I know that my allowable depletion is at 50% of available water capacity, it turns out to be 3.1 inches. Now, comparing these two numbers, I can tell that I'm not going to see any crop stress today because my deficit is lower than what I can really afford to lose, right? So there's quite a bit of difference between these two quantities. However, making irrigation decisions is not that simple. There's other constraints you have to account for. It might not be easy at some of your farms, some of your clients' farms, to replenish 2 inches of water in one go, right? And this is where pumping constraints come in, your capacity on the wells. And for this, I tried to do my own thing, but this resource from Oklahoma Extension was great, which is where you have different pumping capacities and then translate that to how many acre inches per day you can irrigate using with that capacity. And then taking an assumption that your center pivots are operating at a 80%, 85% application efficiency, you know what you can actually put on. And then you can really start to seeing how much of the ET can you replace with these pumping capacities, right? And this particular example is for cotton for grown on a 60-acre center pivot field. And these yellow color really represents a recommendation that comes out of the Southern Plains that irrigating at 85% replacement of ET is good for water use efficiency. So we're trying to do some kind of a planned deficit irrigation where we're really not after yields, but water use efficiency. So using this comparison, but also looking at your pumping capacity constraints is going to land you with a good decision, essentially, what works for your farm. Now, this crop coefficient concept, are there situations where this wouldn't be able to give you good decisions? Yes. Particularly if you are expecting water stress and some significant soil wetting, it can really throw away those numbers. And you really, it's not uncommon to get into these situations, especially with limited pumping capacities, right? You know, if you know you're going to get into stress, the crop coefficient concept in the way that I described it is not going to be an optimal choice. However, there's a better version of doing things. There's a concept called a dual crop coefficient method, which really allows you to break the crop coefficient down to a plant component, so a transpiration component and an evaporation component. And if you go by this approach, you can really resolve the stress issue as well as the soil wetting changes. Essentially, what's happening here is, so this darker solid line is the KCB. So this KCB is called a basal crop coefficient. It only represents the transpiration component. So only the water vapor leaving the leaves themselves. So, and under this assumption, this is the evapotranspiration that will happen when the soil surface is visually dry, but there's still enough water to not cause water stress. So when you're under that situation, you can hope to track this KCB curve. The next term in the equation is the evaporation coefficient. This evaporation coefficient will play a significant role whenever there's some sort of wetting. It could either be rain or it could also be irrigation events. Whenever you're seeing fresh water on the surface, that'll be another source of evaporation, right? And that is when you see these spikes coming in. And the spikes are essentially the KE coefficient. Because you have this additional water that's just sitting there to be evaporated. If you're not accounting for this, your calculations may go wrong. And then you can see that in the early stages and the later stages, when there's unclosed canopy, the KE component is really significant. That is when, because the energy can really reach the soil, the water pooled on the soil surface to evaporate it. But under closed canopy, the KE has a smaller part to play. And then there's the stress coefficient. This is really important. For example, in limited pumping capacity situations, this is going to be really important because this applies to the transpiration part. This applies to KCB. It ranges from 0 to 1. So if it's 1, it's not going to make any changes to KCB, which means that there's no stress. However, if stress starts to incur, this value of Ks will be smaller than 1, which means it'll lower the KCB, which will limit the transpiration and essentially crop growth, which is tracked by this other dotted line, the broken line. This is what your transpiration will be if you're under limited soil water conditions, which is when you'll start to see yield penalties as well. So this curve really allows us to get into those specialized situations that are really realistic. Those are not uncommon. Now, you may ask, hey, this is too much work. Who's going to crunch these numbers on a spreadsheet, right? Yeah, you don't have to do that. So in the last year or so, we've been working on this tool that allows us to resolve evapotranspiration using the dual crop coefficient approach in a programming language called Python. And of course, yes, I'm not asking you to learn Python and do things, but this is really a starting point for irrigation engineers like me, as well as irrigation specialists, to come in and translate this tool to usable tools that does this for you, right? Because so far people were just crunching numbers on spreadsheets. Every state's spreadsheets was a different spreadsheet. They didn't really align with each other, and that's where issues started, right? Because numbers could not be compared across different fields and ecosystems. So doing these computations in a reproducible way, as well as a computationally inexpensive way, was a big need. And with this, we're achieving that. All right, so you can use the crop coefficient concept, but there's a few things that I need to keep in mind that are really best practices. And with following these, you're also not too susceptible to some pitfalls that one can encounter while doing these. So, and this one seems like a no-brainer essentially, but I've seen this happen many, many times. If your mesonet network is reporting grass reference ET, stick to grass reference crop coefficients. And if it's I know in the plains, everybody likes to use the grass reference ET. Out in the west, we're alfalfa reference ET. But if you don't understand these concepts very well, you can get into a situation where you're using alfalfa reference ET with a grass reference crop coefficient, which would overestimate your ET numbers, and that'll result in more losses, right? And a good thing to note here is really the subscript. So the O represents for grass, R represents alfalfa. And all the values that are in those tables are grass reference. And even the mesonet, what mesonet uses for irrigation planner is grass reference. Just keep that in mind. The other one is, what are the weather stations that you're using for reference ET? Essentially, you want to resolve this equation, or mesonet does, but not all mesonet stations are the same. And especially out in the West, where I'm at, you can have stations like this, which are great, because here you can expect your weather variables to be conditioned over a well-watered surface. But you can also have these. And if you're reading your weather over places like these, it's not going to do a good job at recreating the crop coefficient. So it's good to, and that's why people focus too much on metadata, because if you take pictures of your mesonet station, that allows you to make these differences out. again, I think I've talked about this a lot already, but wherever possible, if you're expecting stress situations, please use the dual crop coefficient method. It's going to do a good job at really estimating what's actually going on in a field. This is an example where this blue curve is what the dual crop coefficient method says the ET would be, and this broken black line is the single crop coefficient method. And you can see there's a lot of times when that evaporation component plays a big part, but this black line is not dealing with it. And this is a situation where you'll end up under irrigating because you don't think the ET numbers are at the level they actually are. Again, FAO 56 is great, but whenever possible, use local resources. And you have those local resources. And if you cannot, because in the current way, irrigation planner does not use dual crop coefficients. It only uses single crop coefficients. So you're interested in dual crop coefficients, do not forget to adjust the KC values in there for your own climate. The values that are tabulated in the document only are true for environments where wind speeds do not exceed 2 meters per second and relative humidity does not exceed or deviate from 45%. We know that in this environment that can happen quite frequently. So please adjust your values. And then the length of the growing stages is an easy job to do. So please adjust your length of growing stages when doing KCs. Something related to that is what do you use as a time scale to define your lengths? A lot of in the current way that FAO 56 is laid down, it uses number of days. We know where it can go wrong, right? Because every year is not the same. There's warmer than average years, cooler than average years. And in those situations, growing degree days are a good time basis to define crop coefficients. Because if you're using this, your curve will automatically stretch or shrink depending on how warmer or cooler it is based on average conditions. And this is something, this has been reported back to FAO 56 folks again and again, because this has caused a lot of confusion. So, there's, by the way, there's a GDD calculator available on the Mesonet website that could be used for this. But FAO 56 is coming up with a revision, supposedly. I've been waiting for it for too long now, essentially, but this is one of the big improvements in the new version where they're going to define crop coefficients, not using number of days, but using GDDs. So we're heading into that direction, which is great. All right, so this is the tail end of my talk, but I want to end here because this is a new advance in the ET world that everybody is talking about, and it's really the state of the art in how we do ET. And this is also pertinent to what you were talking about because this is inspired from the crop coefficient approach as well. The only difference is that our inputs are coming from the space, and specifically the Landsat program by NASA. So what these models are doing, these are energy budget models, and we're looking at greenness, and they're looking at temperatures of the surface. Of course, greenness is an indicator of vigor, as well as the temperature is a good quantity to track for water stress, because if something's water stress, it's not transpiring at its optimum rate. As a result, it'll have a higher apparent temperature, because evaporation causes cooling. So if things are evapotranspiring in a nicer way at its full potential rate, the surface will likely be cooler. So merging these two phenomena, the models, of course, they're more complicated than this, but this is the information that goes into it. And essentially, they've come up with a portal where you can, and you can do this right now, you can just log on to OpenET and essentially get site-specific ET values for anywhere in the Western US and the Central US. So this is the website. and this is just a demo that I included. There's two types of information. There's field summaries, which includes field boundaries for individual fields, but also there's gridded data, which means that there's pixel by pixel information, which is a 30 by 30 meter pixel. Not sure why it stopped, but I do want to go through with this because this is really interesting. It'll be okay if you just skip a little bit, please, if you can, but we're almost there, so it's fine. Yeah, it's not working. I'm sorry. I put a demo in, but it is. So I think in this demo, I'm accessing the gridded data set. And then you can search by keywords, or you can zoom in to anywhere you like. For this demo, I went with Guyman, Oklahoma, the Panhandle area, and then you can start to see the center pivots are already looking different than the landscape because they're cooler, right? Because of all the ET that's happening. So you can zoom in, click on any pixel, and this is where you can get into spatial variability dynamics because a pixel is 30 by 30 meter. And then you can look at monthly data sets for the past few years, but that's not something that we're interested in from an irrigation standpoint. So there's daily data as well. There's cumulative across the year, but also there's daily ET. And this is where you can download things. And this does not have a lot of latency. So you see, I pulled this up yesterday, and there was data for yesterday, so December 16th. So if you can really use this to bypass essentially the crop coefficient method and really get to ET numbers and try to look at some of that balance in your soil column of rainfall and ET. And there's 6 models on the right, but there's what we're looking at right now is an ensemble, which means it's think of it as a average across the 6 models, because of course one model can go wrong in some situations, but it's better to bet on a bunch of models than one. And this is it. So try playing with some of this. There's a lot of evaluation efforts in place right now for this. But we're already seeing that this has a lot of skill compared to the methods, the legacy methods that we've been using. And that is all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Questions for Dr. Kukal?
I got a couple. We'll start with, how open is OpenET? Is it an open, wide API that anybody can pull into and integrate, or is there a pay-to-play feature within it?
It is an API. There is an API, but the API has a ceiling, which means that you start incurring some costs when you pull up large volumes of data. I'm using some of this for my research right now. I haven't touched that ceiling yet, so it's quite good in terms of shareability. And
so I've got another question going back to the crop coefficients, because there's so many now models, so many apps, programs that are doing ET and such. How do you know if the program how do you know what crop coefficient the program you're using has when it's something free through your seed company or
sure,
fertilizer company?
If those, what I've found out is if those are commercial products, a lot of that development phases, we are blind to that. It's not very transparent to see what those crop coefficients are. But if I had to take a guess, I would say they're FAO56 stable values, because that is a good starting point. If you're getting into that territory when you do not have local information, it's good to go with FAO56.
Any more questions? No?
No, sir. But we have something that's called AgriMet, which is a Bureau of Reclamation program. And it's very similar, with the only difference being that we do not measure soil moisture. So we've been pushing hard to have our own mesonet, essentially, which would also help us with the density of the stations. But a lot of states in the West rely on the Bureau for weather measurements rather than having state-specific programs. It certainly is. It certainly is. I will tell you that in all my conversations with the legislators as well as within the university and other stakeholders, I've been using the Oklahoma Mesonet as a holy grail to push for. What is the difference between alfalfa and grass?
Evaporate more.
So alfalfa evapotranspiration, alfalfa reference evaporation would be higher than grass. And the reason behind that is a higher leaf area and a smaller resistance to exchange of water vapor from the leaf to the atmosphere.
Any more questions?
If it weren't for alfalfa and evapotranspiring so much, West would not have the water issues it's having. So the grass reference in how it's defined is a cool season grass. And again, it's all hypothetical.
More questions? Not. Thank you so much, Dr.
Well,
Cook.
thank you. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Golson again. We requested him. He presented two topics, and we said, "Can you do both of them?" So, and he accepted our invitation. Thank you so much. So he'll be talking about tillage and cover crops, their effect on soil moisture in cotton.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have to introduce myself, and unfortunately, y'all have to hear me twice. Just to kind of break up, I want to say a quick story that kind of relates to some of the stuff we've been talking about. So I mentioned I have two children. I have a daughter that's 10 and a son that's 12, and my daughter is just ready to bust through the door and hasn't ever met a stranger and wants to be the life of the party. And my son is as shy as can be and calculates everything he does and doesn't want to do anything unless he's 100% correct, or he feels like he's 100% correct onto it. And so when my son was starting school, back, when he was starting kindergarten, and my wife had stayed home with my kids, so he was by his mom's hip all the time, and so as we started getting ready to drop him off to school, his mom was really worried about how he was going to react without being next to mom and at home and with new kids. And so we really worked on him, and we started talking to him about, all right, you're going to go to school and it's going to be in 6 months and you're going to have Miss so-and-so. And kept talking about trying to explain the whole scenario with him. And so that nothing would be a surprise. And then, all right, we're 3 months away. You're going to be starting school here coming up. And your friend George and Walker are going to be in your class, and they're going to be sitting in there with you, and kind of talked about the whole day. You're going to start, and then we're going to pick you up at 3. Then we started the countdown. They're like, all right, we're 1 week away. You're ready to go to school. And then we went in, 3 days out to tomorrow is the day you're going to school tomorrow. We hyped him up so much, and he was ready to go, and we drop him off, and he pounces and jogs into school and comes out. My wife was stressed all day long, and then he comes jogging and bouncing out of the class at the end of the day. And then the big sigh of relief that my wife had, I was like, okay, he enjoyed it. And then he comes back and said, I had the best day. School was great. I just really enjoyed it. We celebrated. We had a great dinner at home and just told him how proud we were of him. And then put him to bed. And then I go and wake him up the next morning and say, all right, son, it's time to get up. We're going to school. And he looks at me and says, I've got to go again. So with that, I've got to go again. So no, and not just because I've going again. I think it's a part of, I tie that in a lot to our extension and outreach work that we do, because we really push, like, do this one thing, and it's usually just that step one. Like, we think whether that's conservation practices or using the scheduling tool or, looking at no-till or cover crops, we really talk about that first day. You got to do it. You got to do it. You got to do it. And then they get these hardware in their hands and they're like, I've got to go again. Now I've got to actually use this. How do I do it? And I think a lot of that, we always talk about adoption that goes into, getting over that hump and then agreeing to it. But I think a lot of the things that we are part of our issue too is not just taking that step and looking at the adoption curve, but maintaining the use of that adoption. And so disadoption, as they decide what didn't work. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Not everything works for everybody. I understand that, but understanding how we use it. So that was my story to say, we've got to push back to day 2 and to, unfortunately, told him he's got many years of school, not just one day. So we look at that long-term effect and being successful with that. So this study that I mentioned when they asked me to send some ideas into it, this is a PhD student that just graduated that looked at tillage practices and cover crops use. And what we did from my perspective on it is I really like to measure things and take in the data from it. And we had several of my agronomists at Mississippi State look at cover crops. We're looking at yield and other aspects of it. But some of the questions we were getting is, how does that affect soil moisture content? Can we irrigate less with that, or if it's a dry land, does that affect it? And so we wanted to set up a study and measure that. And so I'm going to go through some of the results that we saw from that, and it kind of goes into that story too of being successful. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve of any practice, it's number one, it's really hard to understand if you did achieve it, if you don't know from the front end what your aim is. And I think cover crops is a big part of that, of understanding what are you trying to achieve with this. And so there may be different mechanisms or ways you go about that, but also if you know going into it what you're trying to achieve, we can determine if you achieved that or failed in achieving that if you go into it on the front end. So a lot of times I think we throw into cover crops and soil health, and it's just very vague, and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so a grower may say, well, I didn't see any benefit from that. But I think it depends on what we're trying. And maybe from what they were looking for, they didn't see the benefit to that. I don't have to go back into this. This is just some of the background, just different pictures, what I talked about earlier about some of the issues that we have. But, going into this is a tillage component to this. And beds have been very important. So it plays into our no-till practices. I've mentioned that we spend half the year trying to get water off our fields, and the other half of the year trying to get water on to our fields for irrigation. And this shows an example of some of the issues we have earlier in the year, especially in the spring as we're coming out. We have a lot of our rainfall. And so beds, not only from an irrigation application standpoint to the way we irrigate, but also from a drainage. Most of these fields are precision leveled, and those beds help direct and get that water off. And so from an early planting, getting in the field and getting it from a timely planting standpoint, but also from losses, when we have heavy rainfalls in the year. And so keeping that in mind as we look at some of the practices and the different treatments that we have. What we set out to do was look at soil moisture. We wanted to measure, are we seeing any differences from that? Does it affect our irrigation? Does it affect our application? Can we increase our water use efficiency? And then obviously we're going to look at water to yield, and then how that it may affect water use efficiency based on crop drop that we get per yield that we were able to give into it, and then looking at some soil health components, and then ultimately look at that profitability standpoint. So just a little background on the study. We call this study 21 gun. We have 21 pipes coming out of each one of those plots. It's very long, as you can see individually there. And we can measure every drop of water that we put onto the plot and every drop of water that comes off, both quantity and quality. We have measurements coming off of each individual plot. And so this study It's on a silt loam, and we had a cereal rye and hairy vetch split, and we could independently irrigate each one of those individual plots. And here's just a picture to show you what that looks like. And so if we irrigate individual plots, and we know how much quantity-wise comes on, and then we can measure how much drained off of that individual plot. And then we have some automatic samplers. I'm not going into the water quality component of this in this study, but we're working on a lot of that from both the pesticide and nutrient aspect of it. But it's a very neat site that we've developed over the years in collaboration with USDA, ARS, just being able, especially from a surface irrigation standpoint, knowing how much we applied and knowing how much came off, and then diving in deeper what that quality looked like. Here's just another picture of all of them. See why we call it 2021 gun. As you go through, it's a good stop for a lot of tours. So we had 7 different cropping systems that we looked at. What we're calling our conventional, kind of the routine grower way of doing it would be a disc tillage. They would subsoil and then leave it as a winter fallow. Then we had a strip till and then a winter fallow. Strip till with a cover crop. We had strip till, then subsoil with a cover crop. And then a no-till with a winter fallow, then a no-till with a cover crop. And then we had what we're calling a minimal surface disturbance subsoil. And I'll show you a picture of what that looked like with a cover crop. Still trying to not do the full disking and reduce our tillage, but is it important to at least go in there and break up some of our compaction issues that we have with a subsoiler? And so this is that eco-till that we used, and you can see a picture at the bottom right. It's trying to reduce the most amount of surface disturbance that we could, but still drive that shank in there and break up some of that subsoiling. So here's just some pictures of which each one of those look like. What we're calling our standard, our control, our conventional. That's what it looked like over the winter. No-till with our cover crop. You can still see in here standing water sitting in there, and then our strip till, and then our no-till with a winter fallow. Here's just some pictures of what we looked like planting into our cover crop, and our biomass was pretty good throughout all of our cover crop results, and planted straight into that in early April with our cotton. And here's some examples. You can see the strip till had a cleaner bed on top, and then planting into our non-strip till, but with cover crops. We had equal emergence, planting population, all that really worked out pretty well going across. And so just to show, this is our individual, I mentioned we're collecting individually application going across each plot, and we know how much water we applied to each one. We used a standard across every single one of these treatments. We used a sensor-based using watermarks. I mentioned that study at the end of my last talk that found that around 90 kPa was the optimal spot to trigger an irrigation. So based off that, we irrigated every individual plot once it reached, and when it got into that zone of 80 to 90 kPa. And we had those set at different depths of 15, 30, 60, and 90 centimeters. And we looked at that based off that different average. And we set them all the same exact distance from each other from the top of the field. And every single individual plot had its own set of sensors. So we tried to irrigate specifically to that field. And that's what that looked like sitting in the plot right on top of the bed next to the crop to try to monitor that crop water use. So diving into some of the results, what we immediately saw, even in going into that first growing season. So this was over 3 different years. I think all this data I have here is covering 3 different years. But so this is soil tension. Tried to describe this graph. So soil tension, so meaning the lower. It's a negative or positive, so it's negative. So the lower the number here is going to be the drier that the results are. And so as you go through, you can see all of our cover crops were wetter compared to our non-cover crops, and our what we're calling our conventional is going to be the driest. And we saw that from year one. We went through, and I had the graduate student Carson make sure to irrigate. So he checked it every single day to make sure the day that he was going to irrigate, he looked at it. And we just saw that the conventional side, it's more or less a reduced tillage system and fallow winter fallow, like I mentioned earlier, and it was using a lot more water. It was getting drier quicker, and so we would irrigate based off of those needs. And so this is actually a snapshot. This looks like the week before the first irrigation. So as I mentioned, we're irrigating every plot individually. So once we start irrigating, the soil moisture is going to be out of whack as far as hard to compare across each one. So this is the last point of where they were all, none of them had received any additional water except for rainfall. It was all equal. And this was right before our very first irrigation, before we were going to irrigate in our grower standard, and this was across all the years. And so you can see statistically we were a lot drier in what we're calling our conventional standpoint. And so this is looking at early. That was just the beginning of the first irrigation. Now this is early, mid, and late season soil moisture, and the trend in that soil was the same throughout the season. And so you can see on the far right, that's our conventional system, what we're calling the kind of the grower norm as we looked into it. And so even I haven't shown any irrigation, but we were irrigating that grower norm, that conventional, a lot more than the other sites. And so even accounting for that application of irrigation that we were applying, still the season-long average was drier for that grower standard. And as you go to the left, you can see the cover crop system were just holding moisture and staying a lot wetter. And so my first question to Carson was, okay, what is causing that to being dry? Are we getting more rain? In more infiltration? Is it holding more water within that plots longer? Or are we actually seeing, we hadn't got to yield yet at this point, and so were we seeing the cotton actually utilize more water? Is the roots growing out and getting more water, and it's just requiring more water because some of our cotton early in the season with these cover crop system looked a little scary on the front end of it. And so we were wondering maybe it just wasn't needing as much water as our grower standard. And so we looked at depletion rates. So at that rate, was it depleting more water faster compared to each one of those treatments? And based on these numbers, we saw no difference in how fast that water is being depleted based on the different it was actually using as much water within each plot. And so here's what between the 3 years, the total average irrigation water use that we saw. This is from 2021 to 2023. And so years are broken up by the different colors. You can see that the cover crop systems that we had, some of them never received an irrigation, and then some of them only received, if they did receive it, they only received it once in different years. And so it only irrigated once. And then as you go to a no-till and winter fallow, that first year it didn't have irrigation, and then we had irrigation the last two. And so I don't know if it's added in here, but 2021 was a really, really wet year for us. We had a lot of rainfall, and so it really didn't show a lot of that. We didn't need irrigation, but also we did irrigate at least once in our standard, our conventional side. But then 2022 and 2023 was what we're more of our normal rainfall patterns, and you can see how much we irrigated compared to the other one. So, one of the first questions we were trying to ask is, can we irrigate less by using cover crops? Is it going to help with that? And the answer that showed that we could. And so here's the big question too on yield. And as we looked, year 2021 and 2022, we had equal yields across each year. And then in 2023, all of our cover crops just dropped compared to our non-cover crops, whether that was no-till, strip till, or our conventional site. And so we saw that drop in that third year. And so that throws in a lot of questions. We worked a lot with our entomologists and other folks to look at. We couldn't quite figure out what we saw. We didn't see visually or even from other specialists looking at what caused that, looking into it, going from that 1 year, just seeing that in 2023. That's the volume. I already mentioned that on irrigation. So when you look at what the yield, and then you look at irrigation applied, looking at water use efficiency by each years is pretty equal across where we saw water use efficiency, but then we lost that, that yield and the cover crops really hurt us as far as when we applied that irrigation. But then from the yield standpoint, not really getting the yield compared to the third year. So we try to dive into what potentially are we seeing. We could see the irrigation advantage, and then we're also probably seeing why a lot of especially what we're seeing in adoption and cover crops in Mississippi is really low. I mean, that first picture I showed you, I think that's part of it. We have our really small windows on getting planting coming in, and we have really wet springs. And so anything that really slows down that timing from our planting windows is going to be something that adds any issues into it. And then we are seeing really soybeans, corn, and cotton, depending on different all the different approaches you can use with cover crops. A lot of the growers reporting to us that they're seeing some yield drag, and it may not be every year. And in this case, it was 1 out of the 3 years. And so we asked the question, I looked at the depletion rate. Are we seeing more infiltration? And so we really dove into, I mentioned we had watermark sensors for scheduling, but each one of our plots, we also had a volumetric water content, a capacitance probe that has Syntec in there as well. And so every individual plot. And so what we looked at was we tried to look at 14 different rain events during all 3 of those growing seasons to see if the cover crop infiltrated more. And you can see here, it's a lot going on, but we actually saw more infiltration in our cover crop. So we were receiving more infiltrate. There we go. If you split out and break it up between our cover crops and our non-cover crops, we received more water. And really, if you look at the change and how much water we had pre-event, post-event, we received more water in our soil profile in our cover crops. And then even if you compare just these 3 as well, we saw a difference. And so that's, looking at from the one aspect, we're like, are we using more water? Is it depleting faster? So we're catching more infiltration, and specifically through rainfall. And we also looked at infiltration measurements with this Cornell infiltrometer, looking at how much it's infiltrating based off these different locations. And we can see we're receiving more infiltration through this study as well, through this measurement in our cover crops compared to our grower standard also. And we have different approaches between each, even on our no-till and winter fallow. And we broke that up. I don't have that in here, but just as a note, we took this as on top of our bed, and then our middles, and then our traffic middles as well. And really where we saw the biggest infiltration differences, and really our no-till had with cover crop had good infiltration, but when we went into the middles of each one, there was no difference across any of the treatments. So down in the bottom and in our middles of our beds, we saw no infiltration difference. The infiltration was happening on top of the bed, and I think a lot of reasons for that. We have traffic going on and compaction. We have our residue, our cover crop. The way we irrigate through furrow irrigation, it really cleans up all that material and that bedding material to slow it down. And that's one of the complaints that our growers have too, is, if they are furrow irrigating, it makes it very difficult for them to irrigate. But this site is a silt loam, and it really has infiltration issues. It crushed over, and we have a lot of issues with that. And so we chose this field specifically for that. But we did see benefits to infiltration with cover cropping systems. And it was very interesting to see that really we saw more rainfall infiltration, and we specifically saw that rainfall infiltration on top of the beds. And then we looked at, I mentioned earlier about how important the beds are into our system. And so we looked at bed height basically throughout. So this is 4 years. This is 3 years of data, and we implemented this in 4 years prior to this measurement. And so looking at how high those beds maintained within, so we compared that across. And one interesting thing, if we had a no-till, so we're the grower standard, or what we're calling the conventional, we re-hipped that, we disc it and rebedded that, and rebedded that every single year. And it's still the one that we did 4 years ago in our no-till with cover crops held that bed height, and it actually did it better than what we did in this picture here. That I was actually this is the no-till with cover crops. It was actually higher than rebedding it that we did that previous fall. And so that rain really melts it down, it flattens it across. And so one benefit is, we talk to growers, if having that, and from a no-till standpoint, incorporating cover crops really held our beds in place. This is penetration resistance subsoiling with a cover crop. As you look at different depths going across, but just real quickly, what this showed us is having a subsoiler and doing that with cover crops really reduced our compaction issues with that. And I think that's all intermingled what we're seeing with our infiltration. So going into our expenses, working with our economist on this, as you would imagine, adding cover crops is going to add expenses into it. And so that's part of the issue that we're seeing. A lot of programs and equip programs that can help with that. But you're adding additional cost. And if we get that third year that I showed where it reduces yield, that's a lot. That's the straw that we lose with the growers, and completely understand that the margins are so thin, and if we have add any risk into that. And so I think I want to show you, let's see, irrigation expense. Here's the irrigation expenses. Obviously had more irrigation with our grower standard. We irrigated more. But this slide here, working with the student, and he got really intrigued with why we're not, seeing adoption. We see the yield. But when we look at risk, it's not just the yield. We talk with NRCS of understanding how much they can pay per acre. And then here's this line here, the risk standard. Anything down below that is going to be higher risk within that. And so as you look at our cover cropping, where not only it's $1 per acre cost that we're applying, that it costs us to apply that seed and to get it planted, but there's an additional with that yield. And using these these 3 years of data, he pointed out and really came up with a number that looked at, I don't think he has it pointed up in there, but maybe they're whatever they're paying per acre, we could come up with, to really get past that, not only the cost of implementing it, but getting past that risk that growers potentially are having based on that reduced yield, that the payments are going to have to be X. We had that number put in there, and I can't remember what that was, but it was over $100 per acre, I think, is what it was to meet from these 3 years of data from this site. I'm going to make that clear. That's where it equaled out in that risk. And whether that number specifically is, I think it's just an important note that adding risk into it is going to be part of the proponent. But we also saw a lot of benefits from soil moisture. We saw, and what we looked into doing, we can increase soil moisture, we can decrease irrigation application, and then we got to worry about that risk. And maybe that's some other management. I always tell them I'm a poor agronomist. I can measure water and tell you how much water needs to be applied into it. And so maybe obviously that full systems approach that we can reduce that risk and reduce those yield drags that maybe maybe potentially see with that. But trying to find, that kind of goes back to my original statement, finding that system that works best for you and what your goals are, and then we're able to attack it from that standpoint.